On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, my film review is Magnolia, followed by my segment, Allow Me to Explain. And it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is Magnolia, released in 1999, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, starring Jeremy Blackman, Tom Cruise, Melinda Dillon, Philip Baker Hall, John C. Reilly, Julianne Moore, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Alfred Molina, Ricky Jay, Jason Robards, and Melora Waters. Here is the synopsis of the film. It is a film about coincidences, chance, alienation, happiness, guilt, dysfunction, and other factors of human life that play out in this complex and interwoven narrative. The plots revolve around a game show host named Jimmy Gator, played by Philip Baker Hall, and his troubled relationship with his daughter Claudia, played by Melora Waters, former quiz kid Donnie Smith, played by William H. Macy, who is having a complicated life after his popularity faded, television producer Earl Partridge, played by Jason Robards, who has cancer and is on the verge of dying, along with his nurse Phil Parma, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, and his wife Linda, played by Julianne Moore, who wants his inheritance. Officer Jim Curring, played by John C. Reilly, who is lonely after the death of his wife and ends up meeting and falling in love with Claudia, played by Melora Waters. Motivational speaker Frank Mackey, played by Tom Cruise, who is known for improving the sex lives of men, but has a troubled past that he cannot escape from, and Stanley Spector, played by Jeremy Blackman, who is being abused and exploited by his father Rick Spector, played by Michael Bowen, to win a game show hosted by Jimmy Gator. So what do I think of this film? The first time I was watching the film, the different stories about coincidences and chance that had nothing to do with the plot made it somewhat confusing for me to follow. But it was all part of what was in store for the different stories that followed afterwards. It is a fairly complicated narrative that one can easily get lost to in the first viewing. The best way to understand a narrative one at a time is to either write it down on a piece of paper so that the viewer can understand how the different plots connect somehow, or maybe just watch it more than once. It is a film that you must pay attention to. While other films would have the viewer not caring about what the plot is going to be since they have seen it before, this film is the one where you do have to care about it since it gives you all the details and information interwoven throughout the narrative, sort of like an instruction manual giving directions on what you need to do if you were lost in a maze or setting up a toy or setting up different appliances you need for whatever room you have in your house. Anderson is meticulously detailed when it comes to introducing the characters and describing the events that follows. He has an eye for bringing realistic dialogue and somewhat makes the film somewhat self-aware in some parts of the movie, including the beginning of the film, if you pay attention to it. I am a fan of the use of long takes and tracking shots that are on display in this film by cinematographer Robert Elswit. The long takes and use of tracking shots feel like a continuation of the same camera technique that Robert Altman utilized for his feature films, as well as the subjective camera movements as the cameraman physically pushes into the character's face or the actions as we are introduced to the characters of the main story. One of my favorite subjective shots is in the introduction of the characters from Claudia to Jimmy Gator, then to Donnie Smith, Stanley Spector and his father Rick, Officer Jim Curring just as he is getting ready for work, Phil Parma the nurse, Linda, and Earl Partridge. As the camera physically pushes in, or in this case, gets up close but not too close to the characters as we are trying to understand or get to know them better. While all the performances in the film are great in their characterizations that they perform, the only actors who I thought made me feel somewhat out of step was the character of Linda, played by Julianne Moore. While she does a great job with her performance, I felt that There are some moments in the movie when she starts to swear, but it's not something that I have an issue with. I just feel that she sometimes overacts when she is in character, as is Tom Cruise in his performance as Frank Mackey. His performance does tend to go somewhat overboard when he delivered that infamous speech that he gave at a seminar full of men who want to feel emasculated to their own wives, girlfriends, or whatever. That makes me think of the same performance art that I see on right-wing cable news shows or figures who often use performance art to talk about masculinity in vulgar and misleading ways, or sometimes act very chauvinistic. While he does try to get emotional in one scene, I often find that he somewhat chews the scenery a bit with his scene with Jason Robards near the end of the film. I also notice in the film that there is a theme of parental abuse and neglect and exploitation from the patriarchal figures in the relationships between Claudia and Jimmy, Frank and Earl, and Rick and Stanley. The idea for this film began just as Paul Thomas Anderson was wrapping up his film Boogie Nights in 1997. Anderson started to write down the story for his next project, and New Line Cinema, which had backed Boogie Nights, told him that he can pick whatever project he wanted to do next. Anderson knew that this was an opportunity that he will never receive again. Anderson discussed the project to the then head of the production at New Line Cinema, Michael DeLuca, and the deal was set and that Anderson was given final cut on his project without hearing the idea for this movie. The project that Anderson had in mind would be more of an intimate and low-budget feature that could be accomplished in 30 days. Anderson began picturing the different actors as he started to write down the script. He started with a list of images and words and ideas that started resolving themselves into sequences and shots and dialogue, as he put it. The actors whom he pictured would later be cast in this project, like Melora Waters and Philip Baker Hall. He had also done his research after the name Magnolia popped up and became the title of the script, and noticed, as he did his own research, that the tree's bark, when ingested, does help cure cancer. His previous experience working on a game show was incorporated into the script, and he also claimed in different interviews that the story structure was modeled after the Beatles song A Day in the Life. And he said, quote, "It kind of builds up note by note, then drops or recedes, then builds again," end quote. During the script writing process, he started listening to the music of his friend Amy Mann as it became the inspiration for the story, and listened to a song by Amy Mann known as Deathly as the inspiration for the character of Claudia. The character of Jim Curry was taken from John C. Reilly growing a mustache and playing an unintelligent cop, as well as doing a few parodies of the reality series of Cops with Anderson. But this time, Reilly wanted to go against type and play someone who would have a romantic lead in the film. Next, Anderson decided that he wanted to create a character whom the audience can sympathize with, and that became the idea for Phil Parma, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman. Hoffman described the character as, quote, "someone who really takes pride in the fact that every day he's dealing with life and death circumstances," end quote. Anderson created the character of Linda Partridge with Julianne Moore on his mind as a character who is a constant drug addict and someone who is alienated from reality. Moore, quote, "Linda doesn't know who she is or what she's feeling and can only try to explain it in the most vulgar terms possible," end quote. For Donnie Smith, Anderson felt that Macy would be scared of playing a big or emotional character, so he wrote a big, tearful, emotional part for him. Anderson next decided to approach Philip Baker Hall after persuading the actor about the significance of the raining frogs at the near end of the film, and then he told him a story, and then he did the part. The story revolved around Philip Baker Hall's trip to Italy, where he did experience a weather circumstance that would play out later in this movie. Tom Cruise, who was a fan of Anderson's previous film Boogie Nights, phoned the filmmaker while he was in the middle of shooting Eyes Wide Shut for Stanley Kubrick. The character of Frank Mackey was inspired by an audio recording that Anderson listened to involving two men talking about how men can pick up women using hypnotism and subliminal language techniques, as they were quoting Ross Jeffries, a pickup artist. Jeffries and other self-help gurus were embedded into the script for the character and his sex seminar. Tom Cruise was later cast in the role after he read the script. The character of Earl Partridge was written specifically for Jason Robards, who was on the director's mind. Robards at the time was unable to perform the role since he had a staph infection. George C. Scott was originally offered the role and turned it down. So Jason Robards ended up taking the role. Anderson originally wanted Burt Reynolds to appear in the film after working with him on Boogie Nights, but Reynolds declined. Filming began on January 12, 1999, and lasted until June 24th of 1999. a total of 90 filming days plus an additional 10 days of second unit filming. Anderson's trademark was his use of long takes, and of all the long takes in this film, that is the most well known, takes place inside the television studio before the filming of What Do Kids Know? This scene lasts for 2 minutes and 15 seconds as the camera moves seamlessly through various hallways and rooms to follow the different characters in a single take. The production design was utilized with close, tight color palettes such as greens, browns, and off-whites to evoke the color of the magnolia flower, as well as warm colors that were analyzed that would later be applied to the film's production design, such as buildings, housing interiors, and other choices throughout the film. When it came to marketing the film, Anderson and New Line Cinema had disagreements of how it should be marketed. He also was not impressed with how the studio created the poster and the trailer for the film. That Anderson decided to design his own movie poster for the film, and he created his own movie trailer for the film as well as putting down liner notes for the soundtrack album and favorite showing the rest of his ensemble cast instead of hyping Tom Cruise as something that he wanted to avoid. Anderson got his way with the studio, but realized that he had to, quote, learn to fight without being a jerk. I was a bit of a baby. At the first moment of conflict, I behaved in a slightly adolescent knee-jerk way. I just screamed, end quote. The film was released with a limited screening on December 17, 1999, and was given a wide release on January 7, 2000. The film grossed $22.5 million at the box office and was a critical and commercial success. The film would later receive 3 Oscar nominations for Best Supporting Actor Tom Cruise, Best Screenplay Paul Thomas Anderson, and Best Original Song Save Me. If there are a few things that I can say about the film besides the complex plot, I do admire the performances and the direction. Though there are some moments in the film that do tend to be overdramatic that would drag the plot to the ground. The cinematography feels as if the audience is omniscient as we witness the events of the different characters in the film, as well as the lighting for the emotional and psychological moments for each of the characters in the film. I highly recommend the film just for these points. We will be right back with Allow Me to Explain. The Senate introduced the Better Care, Better Jobs Act after it failed to address the proposal of injecting $400 billion in spending on home and community-based services. So what does this important piece of legislation do, and how will it help the disability community? It's time for Allow Me to Explain. The Senate last week introduced the Better Care, Better Jobs Act after it failed to gain traction in the last legislative session. The bill was introduced by Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania and Representative Debbie Dingell from Michigan. Senator Bob Casey, after he introduced the bill, said, quote, across this nation, seniors and people with disabilities are struggling to find and afford care, forcing families to make difficult decisions like leaving the workforce in order to care for a loved one. The Better Care, Better Jobs Act is a generational investment in home care. It's about both caring for our loved ones and making the smart economic choice for families and communities across all levels of the government to strengthen this workforce. To understand the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, you have to look at the background that led to the creation of this legislation. According to the website nahc.org and its fact sheet, quote, Medicaid Home and Community-Based Services, also known as HCBS, enables seniors and people with disabilities to remain in their homes, stay active in their communities, and lead independent lives. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted anew how critical these services are for beneficiaries and their families' well-being and safety. The home has long been the most desired site of care, and Medicaid HCBS recipients consistently report high satisfaction with these services, end quote. The data provided by NAHC.org states that nearly 5 million Medicaid beneficiaries are enrolled in HCBS programs, with some 2.4 million workers providing these services. The issues is not just the wait list that makes it a growing issue for Medicaid, but also during the COVID-19 pandemic, the direct care workforce has faced a shortage that became exacerbated during the pandemic. According to the website disabilityscoop.com, quote, disability advocates have been pushing for years for additional federal investment in home and community-based services, citing the year-long waiting list facing many with disabilities who want to receive care in the community, as well as the severe difficulties providers have in attracting and retaining the direct support workers, a situation exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The website nahc.org has stated that Medicaid has been an underfunded program since many providers around the country have not elected to participate in it due to its low reimbursement rates. A survey conducted by DisabilityScoop.com found that nationwide disability service providers would turn away new referrals at 83%, while 63% had discontinued programs and services. Over half said they were considering additional closures. So, what can be done now to address this issue? Well, in the last congressional session, Senator Bob Casey and Representative Debbie Dingell introduced the Better Care, Better Jobs Act in 2021. The legislation was meant to make these key improvements to the Medicaid program, such as permanently increasing the federal Medicaid assistance percentage by 10% for HCBS, also known as FMAP, expanded HCBS to require personal care services, family caregiver support, and respite care. Address and annually update HCBS payment rates with an opportunity for public input. Update and develop training opportunities for the workforce. Require a maintenance of effort mandating that new funds supplement and not supplant current outlays. Make permanent spousal impoverished protections for recipients of HCBS. Make permanent the Medicaid Money Follows the Person program. The legislation originally had bipartisan support after it was introduced in June of 2021 and was part of the Build Back Better infrastructure bill. But Joe Manchin of West Virginia defected and the bill died on the floor, basically to make way for what is now the Inflation Reduction Program that is now part of the Build Back Better bill that is now part of the law. So, late last week, on January 26th, Senator Bob Casey and Representative Debbie Dingell introduced a slimmer version of the bill. It would still keep the same language from the previous legislation. According to McKnight'sHomeCare.com, quote, it would enhance Medicaid funding and potentially help an estimated 650,000 Americans get off of wait lists for in-home caregivers, end quote. Casey's spokesperson stated that the Congressional Budget Office estimates the price tag to be at $300 million. While the legislation would still keep the permanent 10% increase in federal medical assistance percentage, also known as FMAP, to states, it would also encourage states to develop innovative models that help states build their direct care workforce. It also provides additional funding to CMS to monitor and support state HCBS programs. So far, only 37 lawmakers have co-sponsored the legislation, mostly from Democratic lawmakers. The best way that can be done to address this issue is to bring awareness of this legislation to your friends and family members and to educate them about the importance of this legislation or bill that can help with the funding at Medicaid and the benefits that the elderly and people with disabilities would receive, as well as employees who work at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as contact your lawmakers about getting this bill passed. This is not an issue that is left or right, conservative or liberal. It is an issue that is crucial to all Americans, especially those in the disability community. This has been Allow Me to Explain. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Radio Public every Friday, as well as listening to my mini-sodes every Monday on the same 4 platforms at 12 p.m. Make sure to go to my blog website at filmtalkwithjordanramirezpodcast.wordpress.com with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts, as well as look for my articles on radiopublic.com so that I can address whatever episodes or maybe whatever movie you recommend to me. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.